I just want to tell you, the scam about global warming is expensive. Now, here are the figures. From 2001 to 2014, the federal government spent $131 billion to fight climate change caused by humans, along with $176 billion in tax breaks. Now, the European Union plans to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. It would cost $100 billion by 2020. And all in all, during this century, we will spend $7 trillion on what looks like a scam. Somebody is stealing the common from under the goose. And you are the goose. So I'm going to tell you how they're trying to cook your goose. You don't want to miss it. And by the way, get out those long johns and those sweaters that Aunt Minnie gave you for so many birthdays and stuff that you couldn't wear. Snow in the summer, frozen lakes in June. We may indeed be getting climate change, but not global warming. We've got global cooling in your future.
The United Nations will meet next week and tell us once again that the Earth is heating up, even though the temperatures clearly show that it isn't. Dale Hurd has the story.
It's already snowing, and one of America's premier weather forecasters is warning that for parts of the U.S., another bad winter is on the way.
It's going to be a major winter for much of the eastern and southern part of the United States. We think it's a formidable winter, but the core of the worst cold relative to averages, instead of being in the northern plains and Midwest, will be further south and east.
Last winter was bad, too, historically bad. The Great Lakes weren't ice-free until June, when the Mountain West was still seeing snow. But the UN keeps warning us that if we don't do something to stop global warming, the end is near.
The report confirms that the effects of human-caused climate change are already widespread and consequential.
But what effects from climate change? The Earth stopped warming 18 years ago, and the weather has made a mockery of climate change predictions. The number of extreme weather events are down. Sea levels are not rising dangerously. And not only is Antarctic ice not melting, it's the largest it's been since measurements began 35 years ago. But world leaders, including our president, still act like climate change is a serious problem.
Climate change is already affecting Americans all across the country, in every region, although in different ways.
This is called a climate scream. It's similar to a primal scream, except it's done by radical environmentalists demanding world leaders do something to stop climate disaster. But the real disaster has been the inaccuracy of all those scary predictions that didn't come true.
By last count, there were 42 separate explanations in the scientific or public literature on why it hasn't been warming. When there are 42 explanations for some one phenomenon, I can tell you what that means. Scientists don't know what they're talking about. There's a real problem with the computer models for climate change.
Why has the Earth stopped warming? One reason, cooler surface temperatures in the Pacific.
One of the major cycles of the Earth, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is a temperature cycle in the North Pacific Ocean, it's gone into a cool phase about 2005. The sun has moved into a cool phase in terms of sunspots.
WeatherBell's Joe Bastardi is forecasting a long-term trend toward colder temperatures.
Over the next 20 to 30 years, I think the general trend is down back towards where it was in the late 70s.
The 1970s was when some were warning of a coming ice age. Yet President Obama thinks the problem of global warming is so urgent, he's reportedly been plotting to make an international climate deal without gaining U.S. Senate approval as required by the Constitution. But the president may be lonely when he attends next week's climate summit in New York. A number of world leaders aren't coming. Perhaps they're afraid of looking silly. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Okay, there it is, ladies and gentlemen. They are the true facts. The Antarctic has got more ice than they've ever had since we began taking measurements. It isn't melting, it is growing faster. And it's going to be one cold weather. I've seen one report that indicated maybe 5 times as much snow this year as we've had in the past. You see, what are they doing? Here's the game. These socialists and progressives, or whatever they're called, want to take control of the economy, the global economy. They want huge government to manipulate all that's being done. And so if they can scare people with this monstrosity of climate change, they will have a chance to get more money. Now, we're talking about trillions of dollars that are going into this nonsense. And, you know, people in colleges that don't go along with it, they aren't allowed to teach. They're not given promotions. They're not given tenure and so forth. But it's all a scam. Ladies and gentlemen, it is in order to get control of the basic industries, get control of carbon, get control of coal, get control of oil and gas, fossil fuels, and all the rest of it, so that they can dominate one other part of the economy. That's the game. Don't let them play it on you. But again, I said at the beginning of this program, the whole scheme since the beginning of this century, $7 trillion in this fake science. You heard it here, tell others. Okay, in other news, once again, ISIS is threatening the United States with terrorism in the Middle East. And right here in America, John Jessup has that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. Here's John.
That's right, Pat. ISIS terrorists have released a new video warning that its army in Iraq will strike back if the U.S. sends troops there. The video, called Flames of War, shows militants blowing up tanks and wounded U.S. soldiers, and it comes just one day after America's top general suggested the possibility of ground troops in Iraq.
If we reach the point where I believe our advisors should accompany Iraq troops on attacks against specific ISIL targets, I'll recommend that to the president.
For now, House lawmakers are on track to give President Obama authority to order U.S. military training and arms for rebels battling ISIS militants. That vote could come today. Meanwhile, the branches of al-Qaeda in Yemen and North Africa have put out a joint statement urging jihadists in Iraq and Syria to unite against the U.S. and coalition forces. ISIS is also using social media to encourage attacks here in America in places like New York's Times Square.
ISIS creates a totally new area of threat for us. They are in also a position to inspire. The increasing sophistication of their media outreach through the internet, through all of the social media.
And Pat, the ISIS threat list includes other tourist locations like the Las Vegas Strip.
Well, I just want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that we're talking now about arming Syrian rebels. I don't think at this point we understand who the good guys are or who the bad guys are, and we're liable to be helping. In the old days, it wasn't too many years ago, the ISIS forces may have been the ones that we've been giving money to, who wouldn't have known any better. And I'm not sure in Syria, you know, I don't like the Assad regime necessarily, but he did keep a lid on things. And now it's chaos in that country. It's being partitioned. And somebody's got to go in and take charge of it. And I wouldn't be surprised if one day the Israelis weren't forced to go in for their own safety to prevent this thing getting any worse. But we have to be very careful before we start voting hundreds of millions of dollars to some splinter group in Syria to say, well, oh, these are going to be the ones we will back. It doesn't work that way. John?
Pat, Dr. Kent Brantley, the American missionary who recently recovered from Ebola, says the U.S. didn't act quickly enough to combat the disease. And other experts caution that if the deadly virus isn't stopped now, we could be fighting it for years. That warning comes as President Obama launches a major new effort against Ebola. Caitlin Burke has the story.
It's an aggressive new effort to combat Ebola.
People are literally dying in the streets. Now, here's the hard truth. In West Africa, Ebola is now an epidemic of the likes that we have not seen before.
On Monday at the CDC headquarters in Atlanta, President Obama outlined the steps the U.S. will take in West Africa. They include a new command center in Liberia, an American general on the ground coordinating both U.S. and international relief efforts, and thousands of U.S. military personnel in Liberia to support the command center. Dr. Kent Brantley, an American survivor of Ebola, says the government's new call to action is coming dangerously delayed. Early on, he and other health officials pleaded for more resources in their fight against the virus, but they were ignored by the U.S. until Brantley and other infected Americans were sent home last month for treatment. On Tuesday, lawmakers held a hearing on Ebola. Experts from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention warn that if Ebola isn't stopped now, we could be dealing with it for years to come. And Dr. Brantley told senators that the deadly virus could spread like a wildfire.
Indeed, it is a fire. It is a fire straight from the pit of hell. We cannot fool ourselves into thinking that the vast moat of the Atlantic Ocean will protect us from the flames of this fire.
The World Health Organization says the window of opportunity to end the Ebola outbreak is closing. They predict the number of Ebola cases could start doubling every 3 weeks in West Africa and could cost nearly $1 billion to contain.
We must move quickly and immediately to deliver the promises that have been made and to be open to practical, innovative interventions. This is the only way to keep entire nations from being reduced to ashes.
Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
Quite a powerful advocate to fight the disease. Pat?
Right from the pit of hell. I think that's a very eloquent statement. Once again, we're behind the curve. We came on it too late. It was already starting to spread before we do anything. I can't see what 3,000 American troops are going to do. They're not skilled epidemiologists. I mean, what are they? Why don't we send some doctors and nurses over there? And we need hazmat suits for them so they can deal with this thing safely. But it only takes one little drop of this blood, only one little drop of this stuff. And if it ever gets airborne, I mean, the world is in for a hellish nightmare. We just cannot emphasize enough how horrible it is. And, you know, there was a book called The Hot Zone that talked about it. But once it starts spreading, I mean, it is deadly. And I don't think it can be contained any longer. Liberia is just one small country. Then you've got Sierra Leone, you've got Guinea, you've got those other countries that are close by. Then you've got Ivory Coast, and then it just goes all the way over West Africa. And they didn't know what to do with it. They don't bury the people properly. And anybody that's got the stuff, just a little drop of blood, and you can get it. And so I think we need to, if you want to spend money, let's spend money on laboratory science to see if we can't come up with some antidote to this dread disease. They were working on something with those people down in Atlanta, but they ran out of this special treatment that they had for it. And the lab said, we don't have any more. Well, I think that's the place. If the government wants to do something, rather than sending troops to West Africa, let's send medicine. And let's get labs going to come up with something that'll kill that awful virus. John.
Pat, a special congressional investigation into the Benghazi attacks begins with a public hearing today. The move by the House Select Committee comes 2 years after the attack that killed 4 Americans, including Ambassador Christopher Stevens. It is unclear if the investigation will deal with the big allegations that prompted the probe. The charge that U.S. forces were told not to respond to the attack with military force, and if American officials lied about why the attack took place. The Obamacare website still has major security flaws that puts private information at risk. That warning comes from the Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office. More than 5 million Americans use healthcare.gov. The site collects their private information like names, birth dates, and social security numbers. Investigators at the GAO uncovered more than 20 specific security flaws, and they say the Obama administration took a major risk by going live with the site last fall when the system was still not fully tested, and some of the testing on the website wasn't finished as recently as June. Pat?
You know, I was talking to somebody who's knowledgeable about what goes on in Washington, and the report, I mentioned the fact that a well-known lobbyist named Tommy Boggs had just recently died, and Patton Boggs was a big lobbyist. But the report that came to me is that Washington literally is in gridlock, that the whole government has shut down. Nobody's doing much of anything. We've got a president who doesn't know what he's doing. The policies are obviously flawed. Instead of coming back and saying, look, we blew it, there's a tremendous amount of cover-up, obfuscation going on in Washington. And the Congress is in stalemate because there's such partisanship. No longer do people want to do what's good for America. They just want to do what's good for their specific brand of politics. They want to set up for the next election who we can beat and who we can not beat. Harry Reid has shut the Senate down. He doesn't let them take up any legislation whatsoever that might embarrass some of the members, so they don't vote on anything. The House is voting some stuff, but nevertheless, it doesn't go anywhere. And so the whole government that we've got, this huge, monstrous, expensive government, is just in a state of gridlock. It's not moving, and something's got to be done. And this president, instead of being America's uniter, he's America's divider. He does everything he can to set one class against another, to stir up animosity, to stir up racial strife, to stir up anything he can, to stir the pot to get a crisis going, so maybe that his party can win some electoral votes. But he doesn't seem really to be engaged, and so the whole government is in trouble. I mean, that's the word I got, and I think it's a true story. The government is just now dysfunctional because the head of it is dysfunctional. John?
Pat, America's waistlines have been expanding rapidly over the last decade. According to the Centers for Disease Control, 54% of U.S. adults have abdominal obesity, which is a waistline of 35 inches or more. And in the study's 12-year range, the average American male waistline grew by an inch to 40 inches. The average waist size for women grew 2 inches to 38 inches. People whose fat has settled mostly around their waistline instead of other places run a higher risk of heart disease, diabetes, and other issues related to obesity. And Pat, as we have reported here right before on CBN News, not all fat is created equal. Belly fat is the most dangerous place for fat to develop.
Absolutely. I feel like Paul Revere. The British are coming. The danger is coming.
Not all fat is created equal. You heard it here.
All right.
A satanic temple is planning to hand out satanic children activity books to schools in Orange County, Florida. The group is distributing the material as a response to the school district allowing a Christian group to leave Bibles, saying their whole point is to counter biblical indoctrination. A representative from Liberty Counsel calls the effort an attack. The satanic group plans to publish material for high school kids as well. Egyptian Christians are calling on police in southern Egypt to find a kidnapped housewife. Hundreds demonstrated outside a police station in Minya province Wednesday, demanding they take action to locate a 37-year-old housewife who disappeared 2 weeks ago. Police arrested some 33 Christians after Molotov cocktails reportedly were thrown at the police station. Coptic Christians have complained about the number of kidnappings of Christian women by Muslim men. CBN News has reported on this disturbing trend and persecution of Christians in Egypt. You can find those stories and always get the latest from CBN News by going to our website at cbnnews.com.